Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Our guest today is Dr. Scott Cowen, President Emeritus of Tulane University. Dr. Cowen served as Tulane's 14th president for 16 years, from July 1998 through June 2014. Dr. Cowen's been recognized for his leadership multiple times over the course of his career, including being named one of the top college presidents in the U.S. by Time magazine. Newsweek twice declared Tulane one of the hottest schools in America. And he's also received the Carnegie Corporation's Academic Leadership Award and the TIAA-CREF's Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for Leadership Excellence in Higher Education. However, the one thing that the name Scott Cowen is synonymous with is his leadership during New Orleans' recovery from Hurricane Katrina, which inflicted more than $650 million in damages to Tulane alone. Dr. Cowen received his bachelor's degree from the University of Connecticut and his master's and doctorate in business administration from the George Washington University. He is the author of multiple books, including his most recent entitled Winnebagos on Wednesdays: How Visionary Leadership Can Transform Higher Education. Scott, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you today.
Thank you. Hey, you have seen a tremendous amount. You were the 14th, I believe, the 14th president of Tulane. You were there for 16 years. But really, I think what most folks recognize your name for is synonymous with Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. You were fighting for your survival. There was no playbook for doing this. So what was it like?
You know, it was surreal. First of all, I made the decision to stay on campus when the storm came. And I was stuck on campus for about 6 days before I was able to evacuate. When I was on campus, you certainly could see the damage that the storm created, but you didn't get the idea of the breadth and depth of what was really happening in New Orleans because we didn't have any telecommunications, no phones, no radios, no TVs. So all you knew was what was happening in the very vicinity that you were at. I wound up getting out about 6 days after the storm. It was an interesting way I got out, but ultimately was hailing down a helicopter on the Mississippi River. And then I wound up in Houston, Texas, and the rest of my team was being consolidated there. And the first time I really had an idea of the depth and breadth of this tragedy was watching TV when I got to Houston, and I think I was traumatized, to be honest with you, Drum. It was so extensive on all levels that my first reaction was, I don't know what I'm going to do and when I'm going to do it. And I remember calling my wife that first night I was in Houston, and quite honestly, I was upset. I said, I don't know what to do. There's nobody I can call who could give me guidance. There's no book I could take out of the library. There's no consultant I could probably hire. And she said, well, you've been in a lot of difficult times in your life before. What have you done before? And I said, well, I always make a list. And she said to me, well, you better start making lists. And that's what it was. It was rebuilding the institution minute by minute, day by day. And I actually have flip charts of objectives we set every single day for months on end of what we had to achieve that particular day to be able to see the next day. So the planning was meticulous. It was unbelievably comprehensive because of all the issues that we faced. So I would say I had served in the military in the late 60s, and I thought that was the most stressful time in my life. But Katrina and the aftermath for about a year or two probably multiplied that by a factor of 10 or 20.
No doubt. And I would be willing to bet that some of the leadership training that you got while you were in the military helped you to be decisive along the way.
Yeah, I have to say it did. As you know, in universities, it's shared governance. So everybody gets to weigh in on, critical decisions. But in a time of crisis, you don't have the luxury of shared governance. It's command and control. And I did remember command and control when I was in the service. I was an Army infantry officer, went through infantry OCS in 1968. So somehow what kicked in was now it's time for command and control and giving orders. That doesn't mean you don't, confer with people, but it's not the time to do a lot of debate. You just don't have the luxury of debate.
No, you really don't. And as the saying goes, people choose to change or not change based on their mental models and the trust they have in their leadership. And in a crisis situation, it's like we were told years ago in the Marine Corps, you need to be a leader because you don't have the time to debate with your troops. Are you going to take that hill? You just have to say, let's take that hill and go.
Absolutely right. And to your point, I actually, within the first 2 weeks after Katrina, actually had to terminate 3 of my very senior officers at the university. They really didn't have the emotional and psychological makeup to be able to deal with a crisis. And I didn't have the luxury to coach them through it. So I had to terminate them and bring other people in who I felt could handle the situation as we interpreted it.
Yeah. It's like you said in an interview that you had a little while back. A bona fide crisis like Katrina requires choices and decisions in the heat of the moment.
Absolutely. It does. So you can't blink too many times when that happens. You pray that you make your decisions based on as much facts as you have, but you never have every single fact, and therefore there's a leap of judgment in the end, and you hope more often than not you've made the correct leap.
Yes, and I would be willing to bet that 95% of your decisions you made, you talked it over with a few key advisors, and then you move forward very decisively. It wasn't trying to build consensus. It's like, what do we need to do to keep the lights on? What do we need to do to take care of our people? What do we need to be able to move forward without worrying about what the press was going to say?
Absolutely correct. As a matter of fact, I did take a lot of heat for some of the decisions I made early on, but with the benefit of hindsight, they turned out to be the right decisions. But at that time, a lot of people couldn't understand, why did you do this? It doesn't seem appropriate, doesn't seem reasonable. But, we believed at that time that it was the right thing to do, and time has proven us correct.
Yeah. And what amazes me about it is I don't want to call it militaristic precision, because everybody knows in a crisis, it's never precise. It's messy at best, but how you were able to keep moving down that path and make key decisions. I mean, putting together a restructuring plan that eliminated faculty jobs, suspending doctoral programs, undergraduate majors, athletic teams, those are tough decisions to be made. But when you're thinking about survival of the institution versus having the programs, it becomes a relatively simple choice, doesn't it?
It does. But what was interesting, John, during that time period, what happens in a crisis, you're doing 2 things simultaneously. One is you're just trying to survive, right? Survival is the key, and then recovery. But what also happened during that time, we realized that there was no way we could reopen in January of 2006 the same institution as we were before. So what it did require was transformation. And it was very difficult for me to get up to the balcony, if you will, and think about transformation, where I'm trying to figure out, how we're going to pay the next bill. So I decided that I didn't have the full capacity to do that at that moment in time. So I elicited the support of 5 current and former university presidents, and they served as a consulting team for me in the fall of 2005 and helped me develop what we called the renewal plan, but it was really the plans for transformation that we enacted in January of 2006. So one of the things I learned out of that is that sometimes when you're in a crisis, it's hard to see the long-term game plan, and you need to get yourself out of the ground level and get up to that higher level, and you need some other people to help you. And it's not a sign of weakness. It's just a smart thing to do.
Oh, absolutely. We don't know everything. If we did, we could run the world very easily. And,
Exactly, yes.
Most of us have a hard time just running our little piece of it.
Right, exactly.
And so having for lack of a better word, a kitchen cabinet to be able to refer to, a team of advisors, is a critical thing for a leader who is going through a particular crisis.
Absolutely. And quite honestly, I get far too much credit for part of that transformation, because many of the ideas came from those presidents, not from me. I had the good sense to follow their advice in many cases, and it turned out well. But it really emanated from them. And what was key, and I learned this from the military also, Drum, is before we actually started is to say, what are our objectives? What does success look like? So we were very careful to say, what is success when this all looks like? And we had said, listen, we've got to be financially viable. We have to do things that will increase the probability that our reputation, our quality, our stature will be maintained, if not enhanced. And the third thing we thought about is, what is it that we don't have to do in order to continue to be an outstanding institution? So we were very clear what success looked like and what the metrics of success would be. And that was very helpful. And it's like doing a mission in the military, right? What are your objectives? So, when you go out to execute some plan, in the end whether you succeeded or not.
Absolutely. It's one of the things I'm a coach on the Leadership Challenge and, teach the seminars. And one of the things that we tell our folks there is, as long as you believe what you're doing is meaningful, you can cut through the fear and exhaustion and take that next step.
Absolutely. So that's why I said a lot of, people ask me all the time, what is it about my background that, was able to allow me to get through Katrina? And the first thing I said, well, it wasn't my doctoral degree or much of my academic training, but it was, training in the military, training as an athlete. Those are the things where you get a skill base that's important to you during times of crisis, but where you just have to fight for survival.
Very much so. And, I look back on my times flying airplanes. It was hours of boredom and moments of terror, but you train for those moments of terror. And hopefully you didn't have to go off script, but everybody flying an airplane at some point in time you did. And that's where all the knowledge, all the experience that you gain over the years, whether in your case, leading Tulane and being at other universities, being in the military, you draw on that, you draw on your colleagues to make what you hope to be the best decision.
Absolutely.
You've talked about two really important things so far in crisis management. One, the leadership aspect, and two, getting your advisory committee together, putting together a plan that's executable and with a vision, but also from a day-to-day perspective. What other things do you think it would be important for a leader going through some sort of crisis to be aware of and to be able to do?
This is going to sound simplistic when I say it to you, Drum, but is actually understanding the situation, or what I mean by understanding reality. One of the reasons, quite honestly, that we had troubles in New Orleans and the state of Louisiana was the leadership we had were acting like, hope was a strategy, so that they would hope that someone would come in and solve the problem for them, as opposed to acknowledging that it was unlikely anybody would come in and solve the problem, and they were going to have to do it themselves. So one of the things that I think I knew before, but I really got reinforced is ability for a leader to understand the reality of what they're facing and not get complacent or misjudge what's happening. Because if you start out with bad information, then everything else that follows is going to be corrupt in some important way. So the assessment of the situation based on best facts available are really important. And then the second thing I learned is obviously your ability to contextualize that to your institution, because it was different for Tulane than it might have been for Xavier University or LSU, because we're different kinds of institutions. And then the third thing is to really make sure that how you're looking at the possibilities. One of the things I struggled with for a while was we knew that survival was key, right? And recovery of some kind was. But it didn't feel like we had to survive and we had to recover, but somehow it felt like there had to be something better that came out of this than just simply getting back to maybe the way we were before. Somehow there had to be a silver lining. And that's what we came up with, this idea of renewal, that this is an opportunity to redefine or reimagine who we are as an institution, such that, we're better and stronger when it's all said and done, and we're not just the way we were before. So a reinvention, a rethinking. And I learned that in a time of crisis, or as you're going through it, is to really rethink, who are you? What do you stand for? What does the future hold, and how do you fit into that future? Those are important lessons. And of course, the biggest one, which we've already articulated, is having the right leadership. It was interesting, and I assume you found this also. When it was all said and done, there were two attributes of the leaders that I found that were very effective, besides understanding reality. One was these were people that were unbelievably resilient. These were people in their lives that had gone through some defining moments that allowed them to be adaptable, to react to various conditions. So resilience was important, and I did some research afterwards to study the phenomena a little bit more. And then I also found, quite honestly, and it may sound trite, those people that had, a high emotional intelligence. So they had this ability of self-control, self-management, empathy, and really listening and learning from others were also very helpful. So, I really reinforced this is working with people who are resilient and have demonstrated resilience in the past is important, and people who have the interpersonal skills that allow them to think and act and make decisions in a principled way based on facts is also critical.
It always comes back to people, doesn't it?
It does. I have a very good friend. He's 97 years old now, phenomenally successful. And he wrote a book, and the name of the book is It's All About Who. And his premise is a simple one. If you don't have the right people, nothing else is going to work. If you have the right people, there's a high probability you'll get it right in the end. When I ask various CEOs or university presidents, what's the biggest mistake you've made? Most of them, and I would admit it for myself, is I put the wrong person in the wrong job, and it took me too long to realize it and fix it.
Yep. Jim Collins, right people on the right bus in the right seats.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I give a lot of talks on leadership, on change management strategy, and it always comes down to the last thing we talk about is the HR aspect. And it's unfortunate, HR has become very much about compliance instead of about leadership and building people. And that's one of the things that I think universities need to do a much better job with, is learning to build people, the leadership development programs. I mean, faculty moving up into administrative positions. There's virtually no training. So the sins of the father, the sins of the sons and daughters, they make the same kind of mistakes.
Absolutely. And, and don't you find it somewhat ironic that given that leadership, and I do, when you get in this debate, can you either have it, can you really learn it? And my view is, yes, you can learn it. There are both theories and practices of leadership. Whether you care to actually execute what you learned is something different, but you can learn it. What I've always found interesting is all of our colleges and universities aspire, obviously, to really develop leaders for the next generation. But no student is ever required to take a leadership course, unless, of course, you're in one of the military academies like you were, where the entire focus is developing military leaders, and those leaders can carry that over to the private sector. But in most universities, students graduate, they never had a leadership course.
No, and how many spreadsheets do you have to lead in an MBA?
Yeah, right, exactly. I've asked students and I've asked faculty, so why don't we, you have a core curriculum, why isn't leadership in the core curriculum? Well, it's squishy stuff, you can't really learn it, it's really soft. But I said, that's interesting. But when it doesn't happen, leadership, right away, don't you? And the consequences are severe. And if there's anything we need, whether it's the United States or the world, it's better leadership. So it seems to me that it's worth more time and energy around leadership development, both theory and practice.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that really, when I was reading about the transition there at Tulane, making a public service requirement for graduation for undergraduates, we just don't do that type of thing anymore. It's under the form of a, quote, internship. But even that is more about learning job skills instead of going out and learning how to be in service to others.
It is interesting. People ask me, of all the things we did, which particular change was most transformative? And it was the one you just mentioned. When we integrated public service into the core curriculum, that transformed the university because it not only connected us more closely with community and being of service, but it changed the student body who came here. So all of a sudden, students said, I want to go to Tulane because I have an opportunity to participate in one of the greatest recoveries in the history of the United States. And therefore, you got students who came there with that particular sort of goal in mind. And it had a dramatic impact, not just on applications and enrollment numbers, but retention rates and graduation rates and the kind of student we got at Tulane. That turned out to be truly transformative. I've said along, outside of the military academy, so I want to put those aside for a moment, Tulane is the only major research university in the United States that integrates public service in the core curriculum. Lots of institutions have volunteer programs for it, but we actually integrate it into the core curriculum. To the best of my knowledge, we're the only major research university in the United States that does that.
I've never heard of another, and it's one of those things, I look back on events that shaped this country, and I think one of the major ones was doing away with the draft. Now, many folks will say that's a great thing, but what I saw was a culture starting to shift away from service and more toward a focus on money.
Yep. It's interesting you say that because, I came out in the 60s and there was the lotteries in there, and I was one of a few, quite honestly, that voluntarily enlisted and didn't take a referral. And to this day, I always say, why did I do that? Because I wasn't even for the Vietnam War, but somehow I felt it was the right thing to do, to be of service. And, I've never regretted having done that. Never. Even though, I didn't believe in the war at the time, but I believed in country and that service was important. That lesson from 1968 to 71 stayed with me the rest of my life, where service was important. So before I came to Tulane, I was at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And there I was a business school dean, and I reconfigured that school around integration with community and service. And I just took the idea from there and brought it to Tulane and was able to inculcate it after Katrina.
Well, thank you for doing that. I'd like to swap subject, if I may. I want to talk about your new book, Winnebagos on Wednesdays. What a great title.
I love the title. And if I could take a minute just to explain the title for those who haven't read my book yet but listening to the podcast. My first year as president of Tulane was 1998. And that year, we won our first 8 games in football. And the last time that had happened was about 70 years earlier. And the coach, who was only in his second year, came to see me after 8 games. And he said, we won 8 games. We're ranked number 12, 13 in the country. I'm being approached by a lot of colleges, to take their job. And I said, listen, Tommy, we love you here. We want you to stay here. Don't take another job. We could sit down and talk about your contract and everything else. He said, no problem. I understand it. So then we win another 2 games, John, and then we're 10-0. I think we're ranked now number 9 or 10 in the country. And he comes to see me and he says, I'm taking the job. I'm going to go to Clemson University. And I said, geez, I don't understand. A few weeks ago, we had talked about this and you told me you wouldn't take another job until we talked. And I said, listen, we'll sweeten your salary, give you more money for your coaches and so on. And I said, if you stay here at Tulane and you go 6-6 or 7-5 or whatever, you'll be a hero here in 20 years. We'll put a statue up for you. You go to another place, you got to win, and you got to win all the time. Otherwise, you're going to be out. And he said, it's not about money. So I said, what's it about? He said, it's about Winnebagos on Wednesday. Now, I can't repeat to your audience what I actually said because it wouldn't be polite, but I said, I don't understand. And he said, well, I've got to go to a place where they're so excited about football that the Winnebagos come to campus on Wednesday and they start tailgating for the game on Saturday. Well, when he said that, I first thought it's the most clever thing that I've ever heard. But I also said, this is what's happened to higher education. It's about Winnebagos on Wednesday now. And I said back in this was 1998, if I ever write a book on higher education, that's what I'm going to name it, because it will begin to show what has happened to higher education, that we've become a commercial, enterprise in many ways that's about Winnebagos on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's neat. And what the playing Tulane reminds me of a song that I had from the Naval Academy back in my freshman year. Started off, we don't play Notre Dame. We don't play Tulane. And,
Now, Jim, I have to tell you now, Tulane and Navy, though, are in the same conference for football. You know that, don't you now?
I do, yes. For years, Navy was one of the 4 independents.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yeah, along with Notre Dame, and we played Notre Dame pretty much every year. Of course, this was a song that was really targeted at Army, but we won't go there.
Yeah, no, we could spend the rest of your podcast and many more talking about Army Navy.
Absolutely. And so tell us, what are the 3 big takeaways from your book?
The big is that there's a lot of innovation going on in higher education that people don't know about, because most of the innovation is occurring at smaller colleges and universities that aren't household names. However, the rate of innovation is spreading tremendously. So the first thing is a lot is going on. It's going in the smaller colleges and universities, and it's beginning to spread, number one. Number two, that despite all the criticism everybody has of higher education today, the return on investment, not just financial, but in terms of health, wellness, community engagement, is as high today as it was years ago. So as an investment, financially and otherwise, getting a college degree is still very, very valuable to do it. The third thing is that we have to rethink about how we can increase social mobility in higher ed. So what's happened with the highly selective institutions, they measure success by, how many people do we reject? What's their SAT scores? What high school they go to? What rank did they have? And so on. There's an automatic bias in there to people who don't have the luxury of having SAT tutors or going to a good high school. So the question is, we're going to have to start rethinking a little bit. Are we just about creating an experience for really good students, or are we really about social mobility, taking people and taking them to a new level in their life? And if so, that may change our view about how we measure who to take into the institution and what we should be doing with them while they're here. So those are the major takeaways.
And those are fabulous things. It reminds me, my alma mater for my graduate work, Fielding, has a huge program in overcoming structural inequality. And it sounds like that's your third point right there.
Yeah, exactly. That phrase, I hadn't used that before, but you're absolutely correct. There's a structural problem here that is thwarting social mobility when in fact it should be doing just the opposite.
I fully agree. So what's next for Scott Cowen? What gets you to wake up every morning? Where is it that you want to go?
It's interesting. What I love now, everybody says, do you miss the presidency? And I say, not a day that I miss the presidency. I miss the people. And the reason is I got into the academy because I love learning and being with students. So what do? I'm in the classroom now. And now I can change the world one student at a time. So if I can get a class and I can have 5 students or 60 students or 70, and I can influence them in some profound way, so 10, 20, 30 years from now, they're different. And I want to give you a concrete example. Listen, regardless of one's politics, whether they're Democrat or Republican, makes no difference to me. We'd all have to admit what we're seeing in America right now is a great divide. It's disheartening to see what's going on in Washington, D.C. And once again, I'm not pointing any fingers at any party. It's just disheartening, the divide, the tribalism. Mm-hmm. So I spend a lot of time in my classes talking about, for example, an article Bret Stephens wrote, The Art of Disagreement. How can we have civil discourse about areas where we disagree without, in fact, demonizing one another, without cutting off the lines of communication and trying to move forward, finding middle ground? And my view is that's my contribution now. Whatever years I've got left, I'm there with the students who are the leaders of the future. And if I can influence 1, 2, 3, whatever the number happens to be, to have different behavior patterns and ways of thinking and doing 10 or 20 years from now, then I'll have made a nice contribution. So I spend a lot of time doing that. I like to do a lot of time writing. And then I also consult with companies, profits, nonprofits. So I'm having the time of my life. I'm doing exactly what I want to do.
That's great. Do you have a website that you can point people at so if they want to get more information?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer. The answer is absolutely yes. And now I'm embarrassed to say that I can't remember the website number. But if they go under Scott Cowen, Cowen, they'll find it very quickly. And I think anybody who cares about higher education would find my book interesting, Winnebagos, on Wednesday. It's an easy read. It's made for the layperson. It's not made for somebody whose whole life is just wrapped in higher education.
That's great. I've learned over the years that you have to be able to write at an 8th grade level for people to understand it. And there you have it.
It's probably a little higher than that, but not much higher. And my wife says no matter what my age is, I'm still a teenager. So at least it's at the teenager level.
This is good. And seeing that it, 8th grade, 9th grade level, maybe somebody in Washington will be able to read it and understand it.
There you go. You should only hope.
We should. Well, Scott, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure being with you.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Scott Cowen. Thanks, Scott. Always a pleasure. Our guests next week are Jerry Prochaska and Tom Netting, who'll be talking to us about the most recent goings-on in the Department of Education, and especially the recent rulings on gainful employment, Title IX, and loan forgiveness. You won't want to miss this one. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and/or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires three things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those three things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.